The smell of burning leaves still takes me back to that October, 43 years gone now, when the world felt smaller and safer than it had any right to be. I was 17 then, old enough to work a man's day, but young enough to believe that people didn't just vanish into thin air like morning mist over the wheat fields. The harvest moon hung fat and orange above our family's land outside Abilene, casting long shadows across the stubbled ground where we'd been cutting grain since before dawn. My cousin Samuel was 19, 2 years my senior and twice as wise in the ways of the world, or so I thought. He had these pale green eyes that seemed to catch every flicker of lamplight, and hands that never knew stillness, always fidgeting with a piece of straw or polishing the brass fittings on his grandfather's old lantern. That lantern had been passed down through 3 generations of our family, its glass chimney clouded with age and its metal base worn smooth by countless fingers. The air that autumn carried a sharpness that cut through your clothes and settled in your bones. Every morning brought frost that crunched underfoot, and every evening brought the acrid smoke of burning chaff that made your eyes water and your throat close up. Samuel loved this time of year more than any other, said it reminded him that everything had its season, its purpose, its time to be gathered up or left behind. Our farm stretched out over 200 acres of Kansas prairie, wheat and corn, mostly, with a creek that ran along the eastern border where the cottonwoods grew thick and tall. The house sat on a small rise, 2 stories of weathered clapboard that had seen better days, but still kept the wind out when it mattered. From the front porch, you could see clear to the horizon in 3 directions, nothing but rolling grassland and sky that went on forever. That particular October had been unseasonably warm during the days, hot even, with temperatures climbing well into the 80s before dropping to near freezing once the sun went down. The contrast made everything feel unstable, uncertain, like the very air couldn't make up its mind what it wanted to be. Samuel complained about it constantly, said it made the grain dry too fast and crack before we could get it properly harvested. The work was backbreaking, dawn to dusk with scarcely a moment to catch your breath or wipe the sweat from your eyes. We moved through the fields like a small army, my father and uncle leading the way with their scythes flashing in the morning light, Samuel and I following behind to gather and tie the cut stalks into bundles. My hands were raw and bleeding by the 3rd day, but Samuel's remained smooth and steady, as if the work was nothing more than a gentle dance he'd been practicing his whole life. There was something different about Samuel that harvest season, though I couldn't put my finger on what it was at the time. He seemed distracted, distant, like his mind was always somewhere else, even when his body was right there beside me in the fields. He'd stop working sometimes and just stare off toward the creek, his eyes unfocused and his mouth slightly open, as if he was listening to something the rest of us couldn't hear. The evenings were the worst, when the work was done, and we'd gather around the kitchen table to eat my aunt's cornbread and stew. Samuel would sit there pushing food around on his plate, barely eating, barely speaking, just turning that old lantern over and over in his hands like it held some secret he was trying to unlock. The light from the oil lamp in the center of the table would catch the brass and throw dancing shadows on his face, making him look older than his 19 years. My father and uncle would talk about the weather, about grain prices, about neighbors who were struggling to bring in their crops before the first hard freeze. But Samuel never joined in these conversations anymore, just sat there in his own world, polishing that lantern until the brass gleamed like gold in the lamplight. When anyone tried to draw him out, he'd look up with those pale green eyes and smile, but it never reached the rest of his face. The night before he disappeared, I remember lying in the small bedroom we shared under the eaves, listening to him toss and turn in the narrow bed across from mine. The floorboards creaked with every movement, and once I heard him get up and pad barefoot to the window that looked out over the fields. He stood there for what felt like hours, just a dark silhouette against the slightly less dark rectangle of glass, and when he finally came back to bed, I could smell the cold night air clinging to his nightshirt. Dawn came too early that morning, the way it always did during harvest time, with pale grey light seeping through the thin curtains and the sound of my father's boots on the stairs below. Samuel was already awake when I opened my eyes, sitting on the edge of his bed fully dressed, that lantern cradled in his lap like a sleeping cat. The metal was cold enough that I could see his breath misting slightly in the chill air of our small room. He looked at me when I stirred, and for just a moment, his face held an expression I'd never seen before, something between sadness and resignation, like a man who'd made a difficult decision and was already regretting it. The pale morning light coming through the window made his skin look almost translucent, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept at all. When I asked if he was feeling poorly, he just shook his head and stood up, the lantern swinging gently from his left hand. Breakfast was the usual fare: thick slabs of bacon, eggs scrambled with bits of onion, biscuits that were still warm from the oven. My aunt bustled around the kitchen in her faded blue dress, pouring coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead and making sure everyone had enough to eat before the long day ahead. Samuel picked at his food again, taking small bites and chewing slowly, as if each mouthful required tremendous effort. The air outside was crisp and clean, with that particular smell that comes just before sunrise in farm country, a mixture of dew and earth and growing things that makes you believe in the possibility of new beginnings. The fields stretched out before us, row upon row of golden wheat that swayed gently in the morning breeze, and the sky was that deep blue color that only comes in October, clear and sharp as broken glass. We worked steadily through the morning, the rhythm of the harvest hypnotic and familiar, the sound of scythes cutting through grain, the whisper of stalks falling to the ground, the soft thud of bundles being tied and set aside to dry. Samuel worked beside me, as he always did, but there was something mechanical about his movements, as if his body was going through the motions while his mind was somewhere else entirely. Around midday, when the sun was high and hot and we'd all worked up a considerable sweat, my father called for a break. We gathered in the shade of an old elm tree at the edge of the field, passing around a jug of cool water and wiping our faces with kerchiefs that were already stained with dirt and perspiration. Samuel sat apart from the rest of us, his back against the trunk of the tree, still holding that lantern, even though there was no earthly reason to carry it around in broad daylight. My uncle made some joke about Samuel being afraid of the dark, but Samuel didn't laugh or even smile. He just looked down at the lantern in his hands, running his thumb over the brass base in small, repetitive circles. The metal was warm from the sun and his constant handling, and I could see where years of similar contact had worn the surface smooth in certain spots, like river stones polished by running water. After the break, we moved to a section of field that bordered the creeky, where the ground was softer and the wheat grew taller and thicker. The work was harder here, the grain more difficult to cut and gather, and by mid-afternoon we were all feeling the strain in our backs and shoulders. Samuel seemed to be struggling more than the rest of us, stopping frequently to wipe his brow or adjust his grip on his scythe. It was around 3 o'clock when he said he needed to rest, that he was feeling light-headed and needed to sit down for a few minutes. My father looked concerned. It wasn't like Samuel to complain about anything, much less admit to feeling poorly, but he nodded and told him to go sit by the creek where it was cooler. Samuel gathered up his tools and that ever-present lantern and walked slowly toward the line of cottonwoods that marked the water's edge. That was the last time any of us saw him alive. The shadows were growing long across the stubbled field when my father first called Samuel's name. His voice carried clearly in the still air, bouncing off the trees along the creek and echoing back to us with a hollow quality that made my stomach clench with sudden unease. We'd been working steadily for another hour after Samuel had gone to rest, and it wasn't until we were ready to call it a day that anyone realized he hadn't returned. My uncle wiped his hands on his pants and cupped them around his mouth, adding his voice to my father's call. The two men stood side by side in the fading light, their faces already showing the first traces of concern that would soon bloom into full-blown panic. The wheat stalks around us rustled softly in the evening breeze, a sound that had always been comforting but now seemed ominous, as if the very land was whispering secrets we weren't meant to hear. We walked toward the creek together, our boots crunching through the dry grass and fallen leaves that carpeted the ground beneath the cottonwoods. The air was cooler here, heavy with the smell of water and mud, and the green scent of growing things. Somewhere in the distance, a red-winged blackbird called out, its harsh cry cutting through the gathering dusk like a knife through cloth. The creek bank showed clear signs of Samuel's presence, footprints in the soft mud, a small depression in the grass where he might have sat. Even the stub of one of his hand-rolled cigarettes ground into the earth. But Samuel himself was nowhere to be found, as if he'd simply stood up and walked into the water without leaving so much as a ripple behind. The creek ran shallow here, barely knee-deep even in the center, and crystal clear enough that you could see every pebble on the bottom. My father waded into the water, his boots sending up small clouds of silt that quickly settled back to the creek bed. He moved slowly upstream and then down, his eyes scanning the banks and shallows for any sign of his nephew. The water was cold enough that steam rose from his wet clothing when he finally climbed back onto dry land, shaking his head with a grim expression that spoke louder than words. We searched until full darkness fell, calling Samuel's name until our voices were hoarse and raw. My aunt came out from the house carrying an oil lamp, her face pale and drawn with worry, and soon other neighbors began arriving as word spread through the small farming community. By 10 o'clock, there were nearly 20 people combing through the fields and following the creek in both directions, their lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the black night. The temperature dropped sharply once the sun went down, and our breath began to mist in the cold air. The searchers moved in loose groups, staying close enough to see each other's lights, but spread out enough to cover as much ground as possible. Every few minutes, someone would call out Samuel's name, and we'd all stop and listen for an answer that never came. Just the whisper of wind through dry grass and the distant hoot of an owl. By midnight, most of the neighbors had given up and gone home, promising to return at first light with fresh eyes and more help. My father and uncle continued searching until nearly dawn, stumbling through the darkness, with their faces gaunt and their eyes red-rimmed from strain and worry. I stayed close to the house, keeping the coffee hot and tending the fire. But every time I heard footsteps on the porch, my heart would leap with hope that quickly turned to disappointment. The sheriff arrived just after sunrise, a thin man with grey whiskers and tired eyes who listened patiently to our story while writing notes in a small leather-bound book. He organized the search more efficiently than we had managed on our own, dividing the area into sections and assigning groups to cover each one systematically. But as the hours passed and no trace of Samuel emerged, the sheriff's expression grew more and more grave. For 3 days, we searched every inch of our land and the surrounding farms. We dragged the deeper pools downstream, checked every barn and outbuilding within 5 miles, questioned every neighbor and traveler who might have seen something unusual. The creek yielded nothing but old bottles and rusted farm tools, and the fields held no secrets beyond the scattered bones of long-dead animals and the occasional lost horseshoe or broken piece of harness. The first week after Samuel's disappearance passed like a fever dream, all blurred edges and half-remembered conversations that seemed to happen to someone else. My aunt moved through the house like a ghost, her eyes hollow and unfocused, jumping at every small sound, as if she expected Samuel to come walking through the door at any moment. She cooked meals that no one ate and set a place at the table that remained empty, the unused plate and silverware a constant reminder of the gaping hole in our family. Sleep became a stranger to all of us during those dark October nights. I would lie in our small bedroom, staring at Samuel's empty bed and trying to make sense of what had happened. His few possessions remained exactly as he'd left them, a worn Bible on the nightstand, his spare shirt hanging from a peg on the wall, his shaving kit arranged neatly on the washstand by the window. The only thing missing was the lantern, which had vanished along with its owner. The neighbors meant well with their constant visits and offers of help, but their presence only made the silence more oppressive when they left. They would sit in our parlor with their hats in their hands and their voices hushed, speaking in the careful, measured tones that people use around fresh grief. Some brought food, others brought theories about what might have happened, but none brought answers, and after a while, their words began to blur together into meaningless noise. My father aged 10 years in those first few weeks, his hair seeming to grey overnight and new lines appearing around his eyes like cracks in weathered wood. He threw himself into the work with desperate intensity, as if staying busy could somehow hold back the flood of questions and fears that threatened to overwhelm us all. The harvest still needed to be completed, the grain still needed to be gathered and stored, life still needed to go on, despite the terrible absence at its center. The creek became a place none of us could bear to visit, though we could see it from the house windows and hear its quiet murmur on still nights. Sometimes I would catch my father or uncle staring toward the line of cottonwoods with expressions of profound loss, as if they were looking at Samuel's grave rather than the place where he'd simply vanished. The water continued to flow, as it always had, indifferent to our pain and confusion. Winter came early that year, arriving in November with a blizzard that buried the farm under 3 feet of snow and made further searching impossible. The sheriff had already scaled back his investigation, admitting privately that Samuel had most likely fallen into the creek and been swept downstream, his body carried away by the current to some distant resting place where it might never be found. The official report listed him as missing, presumed dead, though none of us could accept that cold, impersonal conclusion. Christmas passed without celebration, the house dark and quiet, while other families gathered to share their joy and fellowship. My aunt prepared a simple meal that we ate in silence, the empty chair at the table more present than any of us who remained. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the world in a blanket of white that made everything look clean and new, but couldn't erase the memories of that terrible October day. Spring brought no relief, only the melting snow that turned the fields into muddy lakes and swelled the creek to twice its normal size. We searched again when the water receded, walking the banks for miles in both directions, but found nothing except debris washed down from upstream farms, broken fence posts, rusty buckets, the occasional piece of clothing that got our hopes up until we realized it couldn't have belonged to Samuel. By summer, the official search had been called off entirely, though we continued our private investigations whenever time allowed. The county had other concerns, other mysteries to solve, and one missing farm boy from a family of no particular importance couldn't command their attention indefinitely. We were left to wrestle with our questions alone, to live with the uncertainty that ate at us like acid whenever we allowed ourselves to think too deeply about what had happened. The seasons turned and life went on, as it always does, despite our inability to understand or accept Samuel's disappearance. But the questions never stopped haunting us, and the silence where his laughter used to be never stopped echoing through our days and nights, like the memory of a song whose words we could no longer quite remember. Time has a way of dulling the sharpest edges of grief, but it never quite manages to heal the deepest wounds. 6 years passed after Samuel's disappearance, 6 harvests that came and went without his help, 6 winters that settled over our farm like a shroud. I had grown from a boy into a man during those years, my hands rough with work and my face weathered by sun and wind. But inside I still felt like that 17-year-old who had watched his cousin walk toward the creek and never return. My aunt never fully recovered from the loss. She aged rapidly in the years following Samuel's disappearance, her dark hair turning white and her sturdy frame growing thin and fragile. She rarely spoke of her son directly, but sometimes I would catch her standing at the kitchen window that faced the creek, her lips moving in silent conversation with someone only she could see. The doctor said her heart was weak, but I knew it was really broken, cracked down the middle like a clay pot that can never hold water again. The farm prospered despite our sorrow, or perhaps because of it. We threw ourselves into the work with an intensity that bordered on desperation, as if staying busy could somehow fill the emptiness Samuel had left behind. My father expanded the wheat acreage and bought additional livestock, and I learned to handle responsibilities that should have fallen to Samuel as the older of us cousins. But success felt hollow when there was no one to share it with, no familiar laugh to celebrate a good harvest or commiserate over a failed crop. I had begun courting Mary Henderson, a blacksmith's daughter from town who had kind eyes and a gentle disposition that reminded me of my mother. She never asked too many questions about Samuel, somehow understanding that the subject was still too raw for casual conversation. But sometimes, when we were walking together in the evening, she would take my arm and say quietly that she was sorry for our loss. And those simple words carried more comfort than all the elaborate condolences we had received from well-meaning neighbors. The creek still called to me during quiet moments, though I rarely answered its summons. The cottonwoods along its banks had grown taller in the intervening years, their branches now forming a dense canopy that blocked out most of the sky. The water ran as clear as ever, but it seemed different somehow, as if it were keeping secrets beneath its innocent surface. I had learned to work the fields that bordered the creek without really looking at it, keeping my eyes focused on the soil and grain rather than the place where Samuel had vanished. My uncle had taken to drinking more than was good for him, though he tried to hide it from the rest of the family. I would sometimes find him sitting on the front porch late at night, a bottle of whiskey balanced on his knee and his eyes fixed on the dark line of trees that marked the creek's path through our land. When I asked if he was all right, he would nod and force a smile. But his face held a haunted expression that never quite went away, even in daylight. The lantern became something of a legend in our family, its absence almost as tangible as Samuel's. My aunt would sometimes mention it when she was feeling particularly melancholy, wondering aloud what had become of her father's old light and whether it was still burning somewhere in the darkness. The lantern had been in our family for 3 generations, passed down from father to son like a sacred trust, and its disappearance felt like the breaking of an unbroken chain that stretched back to our earliest days in Kansas. Other young men in the county had gone missing over the years, though none under circumstances as mysterious as Samuel's disappearance. Most had simply left home to seek their fortunes in the territories or the growing cities back east, and while their families grieved their absence, at least they knew their sons were alive somewhere in the world. We had no such comfort, no letters or reports from distant places, nothing but questions that multiplied rather than diminished with the passage of time. The sheriff who had investigated Samuel's disappearance had died 2 years earlier, taking with him any insights or theories he might have developed about the case. His replacement was a younger man who had never known Samuel and showed little interest in reopening an investigation that had yielded no results the first time around. The official files gathered dust in the county courthouse, and Samuel's name gradually faded from public memory, though it remained burned into our hearts like a brand. By the 6th anniversary of his disappearance, I had almost convinced myself that we would never know what had happened to Samuel, that some mysteries were simply not meant to be solved. The human heart, I had learned, could adapt to almost any burden if it had to, could find ways to function despite carrying the weight of unanswered questions. But fate, it seemed, had other plans for our family's long-buried secrets. The spring of 1889 brought flooding unlike anything our county had seen in living memory, the creek swelling to a raging torrent that spilled over its banks and turned our bottom pasture into a temporary lake. For 3 days, brown water rushed through the cottonwoods with the force of divine judgment, carrying away everything that wasn't rooted deep enough to withstand its fury: fence posts, hay bales, even an old plough that had been abandoned near the water's edge for years. When the flood finally receded, it left behind a landscape transformed, the familiar contours of the creek bank carved into strange new shapes by the power of rushing water. Trees that had stood for decades lay uprooted, their massive root systems exposed like the skeletons of prehistoric beasts. The water had scoured channels where none had existed before and filled others that had guided the creek's flow for generations, as if nature herself had decided to redraw the map of our small corner of the world. I was walking the damaged fence line 3 days after the water went down, assessing what would need to be rebuilt and what could be salvaged, when something caught my eye in a shallow depression that the flood had carved into the bank. At first, I thought it was just another piece of debris, a rusty bucket or broken piece of farm equipment that the water had uncovered and then abandoned when it lost its power to carry such burdens. But as I drew closer, my heart began to pound with a recognition that my mind was still reluctant to accept. Half buried in the mud and tangled in the exposed roots of a fallen willow was a lantern, its brass base green with tarnish and its glass chimney cracked but still intact, even after 6 years and countless storms, even coated with mud and festooned with creek weeds. I knew that lantern as well as I knew my own face in the mirror. My hands shook as I pulled it free from the clutching roots and cleaned away enough mud to reveal the familiar scratches and dents that marked it as Samuel's grandfather's lantern, the one that had vanished with him on that October day so long ago. The brass was pitted with corrosion, and the glass was clouded with age and abuse, but there was no mistaking the distinctive shape of the base or the particular way the handle attached to the top of the chimney assembly. I sat there on the muddy bank for a long time, turning the lantern over in my hands and trying to understand what its presence here might mean. If Samuel had indeed fallen into the creek, as the sheriff had theorized, the lantern should have been swept downstream along with his body. But here it was, buried in the bank less than 50 yards from where he had last been seen, as if it had been waiting all these years for the right combination of weather and water to reveal itself. The location troubled me more than I cared to admit. The depression where I'd found the lantern was on the opposite side of the creek from where Samuel had been sitting, and several feet above the normal high water mark. For the lantern to have ended up there naturally, it would have had to cross the creek somehow and then work its way uphill, both of which seemed unlikely for an object that should have sunk like a stone when it hit the water. I carried the lantern home in a grain sack, not ready to explain to my family what I had found or what it might mean. The discovery had awakened questions I thought I had learned to live with, doubts and theories that I had pushed deep into the corners of my mind where they couldn't torment me on a daily basis. But now they came flooding back with the same relentless power as the creek water that had uncovered Samuel's lantern after 6 years of hiding. That night, I sat on my bed and examined the lantern by the light of a newer, more efficient lamp that had long since replaced the older model for everyday use. Despite its ordeal in the creek bank, the internal mechanisms were still functional, the wick holder and fuel reservoir intact, though corroded. Someone had filled it recently before it disappeared. I could still smell the faint odor of kerosene when I unscrewed the base, though most of the fuel had long since evaporated or leaked away. The more I studied the lantern, the more convinced I became that its placement in that muddy depression had been deliberate rather than accidental. The spot was sheltered from the main current by the roots of the willow tree, protected in a way that might preserve something for years if someone had wanted to hide it there. But who would have done such a thing? And why? And what had become of Samuel if his lantern had been deliberately concealed rather than lost to the waters of the creek? Sleep eluded me that night as I wrestled with the implications of finding Samuel's lantern in such an unlikely location. By morning, I had convinced myself that I needed to search the area more thoroughly to see what other secrets the flood might have revealed after 6 years of keeping them buried. The discovery of the lantern felt like the first piece of a puzzle that I was finally ready to solve, regardless of what truth it might reveal about my cousin's fate. I returned to the creek just after dawn, bringing along a shovel and a rake to help me search through the mud and debris that the receding floodwater had left behind. The morning air was crisp and clean, washed by the recent rains and filled with the green scent of new growth that always followed the spring floods. Birds were already returning to nest in the surviving trees, their cheerful songs a sharp contrast to the grim purpose that had brought me back to this place. The depression where I'd found the lantern was larger than it had seemed the day before, carved deep into the bank by the force of rushing water. As I began to carefully sift through the mud and fallen branches, I found other objects that the flood had disinterred: rusted horseshoes, broken pottery, even a few coins that had probably been lost decades earlier by travelers crossing the creek. But nothing else that belonged to Samuel, nothing that could tell me what had happened to him. It was nearly noon when my shovel struck something solid buried deeper in the mud. Something that felt different from the stones and roots I had been uncovering all morning. I dropped to my knees and began digging with my hands, feeling through the cold muck until my fingers closed around what felt like metal, smooth and curved and unmistakably man-made. My heart hammered against my ribs as I worked to free whatever I had found, hoping and dreading in equal measure what it might turn out to be. What emerged from the mud was a belt buckle, tarnished silver with the initials SM, engraved in flowing script across its face. Samuel Morrison, my cousin's full name inscribed in the formal style that had been popular when he was younger. The buckle was attached to several inches of leather that had somehow survived its years in the creek bank. Though the rest of the belt had long since rotted away, I cleaned it as well as I could with creek water, revealing the familiar scratches and wear marks that proved it had indeed belonged to Samuel. The discovery of the belt buckle so close to the lantern confirmed my growing suspicion that Samuel hadn't simply drowned and been swept downstream, as everyone had assumed. Someone had buried these items here deliberately, perhaps as a way of disposing of evidence, or maybe as some kind of memorial to my vanished cousin. But who would have done such a thing, and what had they done with Samuel himself? I continued searching until the shadows grew long, finding nothing else that belonged to Samuel, but uncovering several more objects that seemed oddly out of place in this peaceful creek bank setting. There was a piece of rope that showed signs of having been cut rather than frayed, a broken bottle that might have held whiskey or patent medicine, and strangest of all, a small cloth bag that had once contained what appeared to be medicinal herbs, though they had long since crumbled to dust. As the sun began to set, I packed my findings into a grain sack and started the walk back to the house, my mind churning with questions and theories that seemed to multiply rather than resolve with each new discovery. The evidence suggested that Samuel hadn't died accidentally, but it offered no clear indication of what had actually happened to him or who might have been involved. I was dealing with pieces of a puzzle that might never be complete, fragments of a story that someone had gone to great lengths to keep hidden. That evening, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. I was going to tell my family about what I had found and ask for their help in solving the mystery of Samuel's disappearance. The truth, whatever it might be, had to be better than the uncertainty that had plagued us for 6 years. We deserved to know what had happened to Samuel, even if that knowledge brought more pain than the ignorance we had been living with. I found my father and uncle sitting on the front porch after supper, sharing a pipe and watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. The lantern and belt buckle felt heavy in the grain sack I carried, their weight seeming to increase with each step I took toward the inevitable conversation that would change everything for our family. The time for keeping secrets was over, whether those secrets were mine or someone else's. My voice was steady as I began to tell them what I had discovered, though my hands trembled slightly as I reached into the sack and withdrew the corroded lantern that had started this strange journey toward truth. The expressions on their faces as they recognized Samuel's grandfather's lantern told me that they, too, understood that we were dealing with something far more complex and troubling than a simple drowning accident. The conversation that followed lasted well into the night, moving from the front porch to the kitchen table where we could spread out the objects I had found and examine them in the bright light of the oil lamp. My father held Samuel's belt buckle in his weathered hands, turning it over and over as if it might reveal its secrets through touch alone. My uncle poured himself a generous measure of whiskey and stared at the tarnished lantern with an expression I had never seen before, something between grief and guilty knowledge. It was my uncle who finally broke the silence that had settled over us like a heavy blanket, his voice barely above a whisper as he began to speak words that I sensed he had been holding inside for 6 long years. He told us about the gambling debts Samuel had accumulated in town, money owed to men who were not patient or forgiving when it came to collection. He spoke of threats that had been made, warnings that Samuel had chosen not to share with the rest of the family because he was ashamed of his weakness and afraid of our disappointment. The picture that emerged from my uncle's confession was of a young man trapped by his own poor choices, cornered by circumstances that seemed to offer no honorable way out. Samuel had been meeting with his creditors in secret, trying to negotiate terms for repayment that he could never hope to meet on a farm worker's wages. The night before he disappeared, he had confided in my uncle about his fears, about men who had made it clear that they were growing tired of waiting for their money. My father listened to this revelation with a face like stone, his jaw clenched tight and his eyes burning with an anger that had been 6 years in the building. He wanted to know why my uncle had kept this information secret, why he had allowed the family to suffer through years of uncertainty when he possessed knowledge that might have explained Samuel's fate. The accusations and recriminations that followed were painful to witness. 2 brothers torn apart by secrets that should have been shared long ago. But even my uncle's confession didn't provide all the answers we needed. The gambling debts explained why Samuel might have been targeted, but they didn't account for the careful burial of his personal effects or the complete absence of his body. If Samuel had been killed by his creditors, why go to the trouble of hiding evidence? And if he had been given an ultimatum to leave town or face the consequences, why not take his belongings with him? As the night wore on, we developed theories and discarded them just as quickly, each possibility raising new questions that seemed impossible to answer. Perhaps Samuel had staged his own disappearance to escape his debts, burying his recognizable possessions to make his death seem more convincing. Or maybe his creditors had killed him and disposed of his body elsewhere, keeping only the lantern and belt buckle as some kind of twisted trophies before eventually deciding to get rid of them as well. The truth, when it finally emerged, came not from our speculation, but from an unexpected source, my aunt, who had been listening to our conversation from the doorway for longer than any of us realized. Her voice was weak but steady as she told us about the visitor Samuel had received the afternoon before he disappeared, a well-dressed stranger who had spoken with him privately near the creek while the rest of us were working in the distant fields. She had watched the conversation from the kitchen window, noting the stranger's expensive clothes and confident bearing, the way Samuel's shoulders had slumped as the man spoke to him. The meeting had lasted perhaps 20 minutes, and when it was over, the stranger had mounted his horse and ridden away without ever approaching the house or introducing himself to the family. Samuel had returned to work with his face pale and his hands shaking, but when she asked what the man had wanted, he claimed it was nothing important, just someone asking for directions to the county seat. This new information cast everything in a different light, suggesting that Samuel's disappearance had been planned rather than spontaneous, orchestrated by people with enough resources and intelligence to make it look like an accident. The careful burial of his personal effects made sense if they were meant to be found eventually, providing false evidence of his death while the truth of his fate remained hidden. But what had become of Samuel himself? Had he been given a choice between death and exile, or had the decision been made for him by men who valued money more than human life? My aunt's revelation broke something loose inside all of us. Tears that had been held back for 6 years finally flowing freely as we confronted the possibility that Samuel might still be alive somewhere, forced to live under an assumed name in some distant territory where his gambling debts couldn't follow him. The hope was almost more painful than the certainty of death had been, because it meant that every day for 6 years we had been mourning someone who might be walking and breathing and thinking of home in some far-off place. We talked until the first grey light of dawn began to creep through the kitchen windows, exhausting every theory and possibility we could imagine. By the time the sun was fully up, we had reached a decision that would have seemed impossible just hours earlier. We were going to hire a private detective to investigate Samuel's disappearance, to follow whatever trail might still exist after 6 years of cold leads and false assumptions. The cost would be considerable, but the truth was worth any price we might have to pay. The detective we hired was a former sheriff from Topeka, a methodical man with grey eyes and a reputation for solving cases that others had given up on. He listened to our story without judgment, taking notes in a small leather book and asking questions that revealed the depth of his experience with such mysteries. When we showed him the lantern and belt buckle, he examined them carefully with a magnifying glass, pointing out details that we had missed in our emotional examination of the objects. Within 2 weeks, he had traced the gambling debts to a saloon owner in Abilene who was known to employ unsavory methods of collection. The man had left town suddenly about 5 years earlier, selling his business and disappearing without explanation, but the detective was able to track him to Denver, where he had established a new gambling house under a different name. More importantly, he had discovered records that suggested Samuel's debt had been sold to a cattle buyer who specialized in transporting men west to work the ranches in Colorado and Wyoming territories. The practice was more common than any of us had realized. Men with debts they couldn't pay were given the choice between prison or indentured servitude on remote ranches, where their labor could slowly work off what they owed. It was a legal form of slavery that preyed on the desperate and the trapped, offering them a chance at eventual freedom while ensuring years of profit for their creditors. Samuel, faced with the alternative of violence or imprisonment, had apparently chosen exile, agreeing to work off his debts in the wilderness where no one would think to look for him. The detective's final report arrived on a cold morning in late November, exactly 7 years after Samuel's disappearance. It contained an address in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and the name Samuel had been living under, Sam Morton, close enough to his real identity to feel familiar but different enough to hide his past from casual inquiry. According to the detective's sources, Sam Morton was still alive, working as a ranch foreman for a cattle operation north of town, having finally worked off his debts but chosen to remain in the territory rather than return to face the shame of his past. I made the journey to Wyoming the following spring, traveling by train and stagecoach through landscapes that seemed to stretch on forever under skies so vast they made a man feel small and insignificant. The ranch where Samuel worked was a day's ride from Cheyenne, a sprawling operation that ran cattle across thousands of acres of prairie grass. When I finally saw him again, standing in the corral breaking horses with the same gentle patience he had always shown, I hardly recognized the man my cousin had become. Samuel was thinner than I remembered. Weathered by 7 years of hard work under the western sun, his hair bleached almost white and his hands scarred by rope and leather. But his eyes were still the same pale green, and when he saw me approaching, they filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. We stood there for a long moment, two men separated by years and miles and choices that couldn't be undone, before he finally stepped forward and embraced me with arms that shook with emotion. The conversation that followed was painful in ways I hadn't anticipated, as Samuel told me about the choice he had been given and the decision he had made to disappear rather than bring shame and possibly violence upon our family. He had buried his lantern and belt buckle himself, hoping that someday they might be found and provide some closure to the people he had been forced to leave behind. The years in Wyoming had been hard, but not unkind, and he had built a new life for himself under the vast western sky. When I asked if he would come home with me, Samuel was quiet for a long time, looking out over the rolling grassland that had become his world. Finally, he shook his head and told me that the man who had disappeared from our creek bank 7 years ago was gone forever, that Sam Morton was all that remained, and Sam Morton belonged here in this place where the past couldn't reach him. But he asked me to tell the family that he was alive and well, that he thought of them every day, and that someday, when enough time had passed, he might find the courage to write. I returned to Kansas with a heavy heart, carrying Samuel's message and the bittersweet knowledge that he was alive but lost to us nonetheless. The family received the news with a mixture of joy and sorrow, relief at knowing his fate, but grief at understanding that we would never see him again. My aunt lived for 3 more years after learning that her son was alive, and I believe that knowledge gave her a peace that had been missing since that terrible October day. The lantern sits on my mantelpiece now, cleaned and polished but never lit, a reminder of the choices we make and the prices we pay for them. Sometimes, when the wind is right and the night is still, I imagine I can hear Samuel's laughter carried on the breeze from that distant territory where he made his new home. The creek still flows past our farm, its waters clear and constant, but it no longer holds any secrets for those of us who know how to listen to its quiet testimony about the mysteries that time and patience can reveal. The truth, when it finally came to light, was more complex and painful than any of us had imagined. But it was also more merciful than the death we had mourned for so many years. Samuel lived somewhere under the endless western sky, and that knowledge, however bittersweet, was enough to let the rest of us finally begin to heal from the wounds his disappearance had carved into our hearts and souls.
If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.